Hey guys, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. As you may already know, that hurricane that hit Connecticut has already passed, and unfortunately we withstood some damage. Power's out. Unfortunately, probably not going to be able to make any vids for a while. So, what you doing in the dark? I hate you. I hate you so much. We're going to do an album review of this self-titled Giles Corey LP. I suppose this is a pretty good album to be reviewing right now, post-hurricane. Giles Corey, this album, I've had a physical copy and a copy of the book that comes with it for months now. I was sampling it here and there and coming back to it, and it just wasn't like clicking, it wasn't clicking with me. Not because it was bad, but it's a really hard to digest piece of audio. There's a lot to think about, a lot to consider, even if you're not taking the book into account. There are moments on here of noise and drones and field recordings, and also shoegazy rock and acoustic ballads and gospel-like dirges with soaring background choruses. The entire LP is soaked in this really eerie atmosphere, and stylistically it's like all over the place, but I would expect nothing less from the guy who's behind this album, Connecticut musician Dan Barrett. His biggest project, Have a Nice Life, has been just as varied in how many flavors it takes on, from post-punk to noise and drone to industrial rock. And I think the projects outside of this that Dan's been involved with have been pretty interesting too. Novelier, for one, which saw him diving into dark ambient music, into black metal as well. It wasn't as well received as Have a Nice Life, but if you're into depressive black metal like Xasther, something like that, it's at least worth checking out. Now, there are a lot of tracks on this thing that are not about having a catchy tune or anything like that. It's more about atmosphere, noise, just texture, style. You've got to take some of the songs on here and maybe this entire album as an experience, or maybe a full spectrum or picture of a certain emotion or feeling. For the most part, I thought this album was pretty creepy, pretty haunting, and it all starts off with The Haunting Presence, first track. That song to me sounds like listening to souls from beyond the grave screaming lyrics against a really somber piano phrase. And there's this rising, noisy, deafening sound kind of just like swelling up in the background, and it's slowly like choking the entire song. It's like indescribable. It's like a field recording from another dimension. This whispering vocal comes up and just sort of introduces itself as these larger than life bass drums are pounding, like knocking on this gigantic gateway or something. And it's like all of a sudden the door just opens, just flies open, and all these horrible, like, mutilated faces are screaming all at once against this organ pumping out these sinister chords. It's pretty disturbing and sick. And the whole track is followed by this really tortured screaming and slamming hands against a piano. It's pretty freaky. This song and a lot of this album is like bringing Dan's capabilities as a singer-songwriter together with a lot of the experimental sounds and drones from that Novelier record. There are other tracks on this LP that have kind of similar swells, like I'm Not Going to Do It. It's kind of like being suffocated really slowly by depression. There are some more accessible moments on here to kind of pad these more experimental ones out. I know I'm more partial to the experimental tracks on this album, but I don't think everybody is going to feel that way. So luckily, there are some acoustic ballads on here that remind me a lot of Grizzly Bear, actually, that album Yellow House, in that you've got these very kind of straightforward acoustic songs, but they're just matched up with a sea of reverb and background vocals, empowering it and just making it seem bigger than what it really is. But in a way, it also kind of reminds me of Mount Eerie. It's produced in a way that's messy, but kind of lends it this unique style that you're not going to find anywhere else. Dan Barrett's production style. Like on Have a Nice Life, like on Novelier, some of the sounds on here that get loud are really overmodulated, kind of overblown. Some of the guitars feel kind of thin and tinny, a lot of vocals in the background. When they're being multi-tracked and singing in choruses, they assemble a little lazily. And like I said about the reverb, there's tons of it, but enough music translates through it so I can actually hear what's going on. You know, it's not like I'm losing the song in the reverb. Plus, Dan loads this atmosphere with lots of subtle textures and just interesting sounds that I pick up a little bit more of them every time I revisit this album. It's like an Easter egg hunt or something. Now, this book is kind of like a different story. A lot of pages, a lot of text, a lot of pictures as well. Like previous projects Dan has been involved with, themes of this album revolve around depression, death, suicide, but there's sort of an added element of the occult and the afterlife and ghosts involved with this. A lot of the pages on here kind of, in a way, look to give the reader some kind of existential crisis, but when it's not doing that, the words on this thing kind of follow the exploits of someone I assume Dan made up, because when I Google this guy, pretty much all links go to this album. The man's name is Robert Vore. Like any good piece of fiction, this book takes what is not real and roots it so deeply into what is real that it kind of blurs those two worlds. So in a way, I'm convinced he's real. His obsession with the afterlife, death, and the occult, they're real. I'm convinced that the hood-wearing cult that he led into the woods, that was real. There are points on this book that reference back to particular spots on this album, which actually kind of made this LP go from being creepy to like frightening for me when Dan was talking about the Vore's head device, which is this weird hood that I alluded to earlier, which is supposed to be giving members of this cult like visions, connection to the afterlife, something like that. And Dan explains wearing this hood and getting next to the piano and just like having this freak out session that got recorded to tape and then it's thrown onto this album. Plus, for me, it was pretty great to get a look into the lyrical side of this album by looking at the pages of this book. Like the song Spectral Bride is pretty much about being so depressed that you want to commit suicide, but you have this loved one that you've left behind that you want to be with romantically. So, you know, you die, but you're still with that person as like a ghost. The context and the ideas that this book brings, they're fine, they're good. I think they empower this album a lot. I like the fact that this album is named after Giles Corey, who was a colonial American who was killed during the Salem witch trials and was basically put to death via getting crushed by stones because he refused to plead guilty or not guilty to the witchcraft charges he was faced with. And on this album and in this book, Dan pretty much puts himself in Giles' place, but instead of being crushed by rocks, he's being crushed by this story about Robert Vore, ideas and obsessions with death and the afterlife and suicide, and of course depression too. All of that is crushing down on him. Now, is this book necessary to enjoy this album? Probably not, on some level. I think a lot of people are going to enjoy this album even without the book. But we're living in an age where, for some reason, people are more interested in what goes on behind the scenes with albums and just sort of what makes albums tick and what inspires albums. If you really want to see what made this album what it is, the book is a must. Sonically, I think the only issues that I really had with this LP, there were a lot of points where I was hearing like synth horns, and that's like possibly one of my least favorite sounds on the planet. I feel like the last track on the album, there could have been a little bit more to it. It could have been a little bit more climactic or something, but I love this thing. I love the concept. I love the way it made me feel, because after I read the book, after I sort of took the album in, it just kind of made me feel paranoid about everything. So if you're in the mood for an album that is gonna depress you a little bit, yeah, I think it's a pretty ambitious work, and would love to know what you guys think of it, if you've heard it. Love it, hate it, why, and what do you think I should review next? Feeling a light to decent 8 on this thing, loving it. I know I've been pretty positive in my most recent reviews, and it's because I have a lot of music that's worth praising. Don't you think? Anthony Fantano, Giles Corey, forever.